Hello, and welcome to People of the Pod, brought to you by American Jewish Committee. Each week, we take you beyond the headlines to help you understand what they all mean for America, Israel, and the Jewish people. I'm your host, Manya Brashear-Pashman. During the Obama administration, Sarah Hurwitz served as senior speechwriter for President Barack Obama and chief speechwriter for First Lady Michelle Obama. But after she left the White House, she did a little bit of soul-searching and in her mid-30s reconnected with her Judaism. She wrote about it in a book titled Here All Along and joined us at the time to talk about it. Sarah has returned with us this week to talk about the book that followed, titled As a Jew, Reclaiming Our Story from Those Who Blame, Shame, and Try to Erase Us. Sarah, welcome back to People of the Pod.
Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here.
So your title has a very powerful accusation. Tell us who is blaming, shaming, and trying to erase us.
You know, it's funny. My first book, as you know, was this love letter to Judaism, this journey of discovery of Jewish tradition. And I loved it so much and I wanted to share it. You know, as I was writing it, I was thinking, where has this been all my life? You know, kind of a lovely, almost rhetorical question. But after it came out, a few things kind of happened that made me actually ask that question more seriously. Like, wait, why did I not see any of the 4,000 years of Jewish wisdom growing up? And what those things were was, the first thing was I trained to be a volunteer hospital chaplain. And, you know, chaplaincy is multi-faith, open to chaplains of all backgrounds. But, you know, the training was kind of weirdly Christian. You know, we would talk about our ministry and our theology. And I was told that prayer is, God, please heal so-and-so who's right here in front of me. And I'm just making this prayer up spontaneously and they can hear me. And that's prayer. And everyone prays that way, I was told. I said, you know, that's not really a common form of Jewish prayer. But I was told, no, as long as you don't say Jesus, it is universal. That's interesting. And then something else that happened is I visited a college campus probably a year before October 7th. And I was talking to students there at the Hillel, talking to a bunch of Jewish students. And one of them asked me, what did you do to respond to antisemitism when you were in college? And I was so stunned, I didn't even understand the question at first. And then I said, I didn't, not once, never, not a single time did I deal with antisemitism. And the kids just looked kind of shocked, like they didn't believe me. And they started sharing stories of the antisemitism they were facing on campus. And I thought, something's going on here. And then I really began kind of taking a deep dive into my identity of like, wait, so why did I spend my whole life being like, I'm just a cultural Jew? I knew nothing about Jewish culture, which is a beautiful way to be Jewish, being a cultural Jew, but I knew nothing about history, language, anything like that. Or I said, I'm an ethnic Jew, but Jews are of every ethnicity, so that's nonsense. Or I'd say social justice is my Judaism, but I didn't know anything about what Judaism said about social justice, unlike these wonderful Jews who do know about social justice and spend their lives acting out Jewish social justice. And so I took a deep dive into history. And what I discovered was 2,000 years of anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism and 200 years of Jews in Western Europe in a very understandable attempt to escape that persecution, kind of erasing many of our traditions. And I think that was kind of my answer to where has this been all my life? And also my answer to why did I have such a apologetic Jewish identity for so much of my life?
In my introduction, I left off half the title of your first book because it was very long. But I am curious, kind of when did you realize, well, let me give the full title of your book. It's Here All Along, Finding Meaning, Spirituality, and a Deeper Connection to Life in Judaism, and in parentheses, after finally choosing to look there. So I guess, how was that delayed connection to Judaism? Can you elaborate a little bit more about how it was tied to these forces that you just talked about?
Yeah, so something that I didn't really fully understand, I had intimations of this, but didn't really understand this, is that 2,000 years ago, early Christianity very much defined itself against Judaism. And there was actually a name for this, the Adversus Judaeos tradition, which means against the Jews in Latin. And, early church fathers very much were defining Christianity against Judaism because back then, both of these traditions had originated from Judaism and they parted ways at some point. And the church fathers were really trying to distinguish Christianity from Judaism and to get people to stop kind of practicing both traditions. This tradition really continues with Judaism defined as unspiritual, legalistic, depraved, dead, spiritually superseded, a lot of very, very ugly tropes that kind of have common themes that say that Jews are diabolically powerful. so supernaturally powerful, you can't even believe it. They are also profoundly depraved, evil, bloodthirsty, perverse, and they're in a conspiracy to hurt you. So there may be very few of them, but man, they are working together to really do harm. And you see these three themes kind of making their way through history, unfortunately, all the way basically until the Holocaust. And I based a lot of my writing on the work of a number of really distinguished Christian scholars who make this argument. It's actually a pretty common argument among Christian scholars. And, in recent decades, the church has very much disavowed its historic anti-Judaism and has worked very hard to, fight anti-Semitism in the church. But, these things really did kind of continue on through the 20th century.
So you do describe in your book moments when you got oddly defensive about your Judaism, or perhaps a bit revisionist about Jewish history and the origin of Jewish traditions, or the reason why they exist now in modern day. Can you elaborate on some of those moments for our listeners and explain how you've self-corrected that defense?
Yeah. I think a lot of it took the form of, oh, I'm Jewish, but not that Jewish. It was just sort of this immediate, but I'm not one of those Jews. Those really Jewy Jews. Well, I'm sorry, would it be a problem if I were? What if social justice wasn't my Judaism, but Judaism was my Judaism? Would that be okay? Just beginning to notice, why am I always kind of pushing it away, claiming that I'm not too Jewish? That's a very strange way to announce someone's identity. I think, Dara Horn has actually a really quite an amazing essay called The Cool Kids. And she talks about these two different types of anti-Semitism. And one is this kind of eliminationist anti-Semitism, which says the Jews are bad. There's nothing they can do to be good. We must kill them. And, that is the Holocaust, pogroms. We learn about that kind of anti-Semitism in school. But there's another kind of anti-Semitism, which is conversionist, which says, yes, the Jews are bad, but there is something they can do to be okay and saved. And that is they can disavow whatever we, the majority, find disgusting about Jewish civilization. So, back in the day, it was reject Jewish religion and convert to Christianity and you'll be saved, maybe, for some amount of time, possibly. In my parents' and grandparents' generation, it was, reject your last name, get a nose job, stop being so, quote, Jewy, be a little bit more, quote, waspy, and then maybe we'll let you into our club, then maybe we'll accept you. And today, what you see is you have to reject your ancestral homeland, reject Israel, and then you'll be okay. And, I visited 27 college campuses, and I kind of saw how this sometimes takes on the format of almost like a Christian conversion narrative, where it goes something like, growing up, my rabbi and my parents told me Israel was perfect and amazing and a utopia. And then I got to college and I realized that actually it's a colonialist, Nazi, racist society. And I had an epiphany. I saw the light. And I took anti-Zionism and anti-colonialism into my heart, and now I'm saved. Now I'm a good Jew. And their classmates are like, now you're a good Jew. And as Dara Horn puts it, this kind of anti-Semitism involves the weaponization of shame. It involves really trying to convince Jews that there is something fundamentally shameful about some aspect of themselves, their identity, their tradition. And today that thing is Israel. This idea that there's something fundamentally is like the original sin of the world.
And you also talk about the tradition of circumcision and how that came up and you found yourself explaining this to someone. Can you elaborate on that for our listeners, which I thought was really interesting?
This was during an encounter with a patient. I was doing a chaplaincy shift. And usually I don't tell my patients my religious background, or I'm very neutral, unless they're Jewish, in which case I do tell them I'm Jewish. But, I was finishing up a conversation with this very lovely lady, and she was very curious about my background. And so I told her, I'm Jewish. And her eyes kind of lit up and she said, oh, many of my neighbors are Jewish. I've actually been to 2 brises in the past month, and she was so lovely. Like, she actually seemed to be just really happy to be included in this tradition of her neighbors. And I got weirdly defensive and was like, oh, well, just so you know, medical professionals, they say, whether you circumcise or don't circumcise, it's really, it's equally safe either way. And, when we do brises, they're often done by medical professionals. And I'm going on and on. And like, this woman did not say the slightest negative thing about this tradition, but suddenly I'm defensive. Suddenly it's like, interesting. I think that it was an illustration to me of the way that we can sometimes really imbibe all of the kind of negative views about Jews and Jewish traditions that are around us and become defensive. And sometimes we don't even realize that they're there. It's almost like they're the air that we breathe.
Let me challenge that and push back a little bit. I mean, is it okay to not agree with some of the traditions of the Jewish faith and be open about your disagreement with that? I certainly know a lot of Christians who don't like things that emerge from their tradition or from their community. is that okay? Or is it not when Judaism is threatened?
So I actually do think that's okay. I have no problem with that. But I think the problem in this situation was that I have no problem with circumcision, but I'm suddenly getting defensive and trying to convince this woman that it's not weird. And I'm thinking, why am I doing this? It was very interesting to me that I felt so suddenly defensive and anxious. It was surprising to me.
And similarly, it's okay to criticize Israeli policy too, right? I mean, it's totally acceptable.
Absolutely. This is the thing that I'm so confused about, where people are saying, well, you're saying that it's not okay to criticize Israel. And I'm like, I'm sorry, have you been to Israel? It's like the national pastime there to criticize the government. I criticize the Israeli government all the time, as do millions of American Jews. This idea that that we're somehow reacting to criticism of Israel, that's ridiculous. I think what we're reacting to is not criticism of Israel, but it's something else. When you have students on a college campus saying from water to water, Palestine should be Arab, or Israelis are Nazis, I just, with all due respect, I don't see that as criticism, nor would I see it as criticism if, God forbid, a Jewish student ever said from water to water, Israel should be Jewish, or Palestinians are terrorists. That is hateful, disgusting, racist, eliminationist language. And if I ever heard a Jewish student say that, I mean, let me tell you, I would have quite a talking to with that kid. So that's not criticism. Criticism is, I am vehemently opposed and abhor this policy, this ideology, this action for these reasons. That's criticism. And I think you can use real strong language to do that kind of criticism. But there's a difference between a criticism and slurs and baseless accusations. And I think we need to be just clear about that.
All right. So you just used the term from water to water instead of from river to sea. Was that on purpose?
Not necessarily. I think it's just a clearer illustration of what I think from the river to the sea really means. That is the Arabic that is used in, from the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free. It's like you can kind of make an argument that this is about Palestinian liberation. And okay, fair enough. But I think when you get the from water to water, it shall be Arab, that's when I think there's less of an argument that it's about freedom. And it seems a little bit more eliminationist to me.
Interesting. I've not heard that before, but I like that. So you call antisemitism the least mysterious phenomenon. Can you please explain what you mean by that?
Yeah. I think like a lot of young people, my anti-Semitism education was mainly just Holocaust education. And I kind of walked away thinking like, how wild that the civilized world just lost its mind in the mid-20th century and started killing Jews. That's so shocking and disturbing. Why is that? And the answer was kind of like, well, the Germans lost World War I, they blamed the Jews. There was a depression, they blamed the Jews. And when you ask why the Jews, it's like, well, because of prejudice and scapegoating. I'm like, okay, right. But again, why the Jews? Prejudice and scapegoating. That's the answer. And it's like, actually, the answer really is because of 2,000 years of Christian anti-Judaism that preceded that. Right? It wasn't mysterious why the Jews were targeted. This was a 2,000-year neural groove that had been worn into the Western world psyche. And this is not my argument. This is the argument of countless Christian scholars whose brilliant work I cite. And so I think that the unfortunate thing about some forms of Holocaust education is that it leaves you with the impression that, oh, this is so mysterious. It's just kind of eternal and kind of comes out of nowhere. Or even worse, you might even think, well, maybe we did something to deserve this. But it's not mysterious. I can show you its path through history. And I think it's very important that Jews understand this history. And look, I think this is very hard to teach in an average American public school because, we live in a country where, saying happy holidays instead of Merry Christmas is very upsetting for some people. They feel very threatened and triggered by that. So for a teacher to say like, okay, kids, today we're going to learn about how 2,000 years of Christian anti-Judaism paved the way for the Holocaust, I don't think that's going to go well, even if many mainstream Christian scholars would agree that that's true. This is a challenge that we face.
So you have continued, as you said, to visit college campuses where anti-Semitism has been an issue since October 7th, more of an issue than it even was beforehand. And yet when you were at Harvard and Harvard Law, you've said you could have walked through Harvard Yard wrapped in an Israeli flag and no one would have said a word or reacted negatively. So what has changed? And does it signal a more general shift on campuses of kind of uncensored, unbridled speech? In other words, if Black students support Black Lives Matter or gay students or marching for pride, do you feel like there's a sense that students who disagree with that from either the right or the left have kind of claimed a license to criticize that too?
No, I try to explain to college students when they say, "Well, okay, my campus isn't that bad. I can wear my Jewish star and I won't get harassed or ostracized." And I say like, "Okay, great. If it's not that bad, I'll just wear my Israel T-shirt and we'll see how it goes." And they're like, "No." And then I have to go through this long litany of like, okay, if your Black classmate said to you, "Well, this campus isn't so bad for Black students, but I can't wear my Black Lives Matter T-shirt or else I'll be harassed and ostracized." I hope you would say that's not okay. That's racism. Pretty clear. Or if your queer classmate said, "Well, this campus is pretty good for queer people, but I can't wear my pride t-shirt." I hope you would say, like, that's not pretty good. That's homophobia. When the majority feels entitled to decide how the minority can embody and express its identity, I think we have a really serious problem. And, sometimes the kids will push back on me. "Well, no, but the problem isn't being Jewish, it's Israel." I'm like, okay, but if your Chinese American classmate wore a t-shirt that said China, even if all your classmates knew that the Chinese government had been interning a million Muslim Uyghurs in camps and subjecting them to horrific human rights violations, would they harass and ostracize her? And they're like, "Well, probably not." Right. Because they would assume that she has a relationship to China that maybe involves having heritage there, or maybe she studied abroad there, or maybe she's studying Chinese, maybe she has family there. I think they would assume that she has some connection to the country that doesn't involve agreeing with the policies of the Chinese government. And Jewish students on campus really aren't afforded that courtesy. And I'll tell you, most of the Jewish students I spoke with on campus, they, like me, are extremely critical of this current Israeli government. Extremely, extremely critical. They have all sorts of criticisms about what's happening in Gaza, of the occupation. Their views are quite nuanced and complex, but there's no room given for that. I think on some college campuses, Israel has been put into the same bucket as the KKK and the Nazi Party. So I can't say to you, "Look, I'm a Nazi, but I'm a liberal Nazi." Or, "Oh, I'm in the KKK, but I'm not racist." It's like, come on, right? These are vile entities with which no connection is acceptable, period. And I think once Israel ceases to be a country and instead becomes the representation of all evil in the world, there's really no relationship that you can have with it that's acceptable. And I think that is a pretty devastating place for it to be today. And I'll tell you, I think it's a really challenging moment right now where I, like a lot of American Jews, I'm a Zionist. I believe that Jews have a right to a safe and secure home state in their ancestral homeland. I believe we have the right to national independence and self-determination like Japanese people have in Japan and Latvians have in Latvia and on and on. And, we've run that experiment of Jewish powerlessness for 2,000 years and it didn't go well. Even as late as the 20th century, it wasn't just that 2/3 of Jews in Europe got wiped out because of the Holocaust. It's that nearly 1 million Jews who lived in Arab lands had to flee persecution, most of them to Israel. It's that 2 million Russian Jews had to flee persecution, half of them to Israel. It's that tens of thousands of Ethiopian Jews. I can go on and on. So we know we've run that experiment of Jewish statelessness and it doesn't go well. And at the same time, we are looking at this current Israeli government and we are appalled. We're appalled by the ideology. We're appalled by many of the policies. And, for me as an American, this feels very familiar because I love this country. I'm a proud, patriotic American, and I happen to very much disagree with the current president. I happen to be very much appalled by the current president's policies and ideology. And so I think many people are able to hold that, but somehow it's harder with Israel because of what is in the air right now.
So really, you're saying that anti-Semitism has distorted history, distorted people's understanding of Israel's history, their understanding of modern Israel's rebirth and existence. It spawned anti-Zionism, correct?
Yes.
Did you encounter that during your time in the Obama administration? Do you see it now in hindsight, or is it a more recent emergence?
I think this is more recent. I mean, probably in some spaces it was, I was in the administration from 2009 to 2017. I never once saw any kind of anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism. I mean, it was one of the best places to be a proud, passionate Jew. My colleagues could not have been more supportive of my Jewish exploration. They were so proud when I wrote my first book. So I never saw any of this ever once. Yeah, it's tough. And I think what is so confusing about this is that we often think about anti-Semitism as a kind of personal prejudice. Like, oh, Jews are fill in the blank nasty thing. They are dirty, cheap, crass. I don't want my daughter to marry one. I don't want one in my country club. You don't really see that kind of anti-Semitism in the circles where I travel anymore. What you see instead is more of a political anti-Semitism, which is anti-Semitism as a kind of conspiracy theory that says that we, the majority, are engaged in a grand moral project, and the only thing stopping us are these Jews. We, the majority, are Christianizing the Roman Empire. The only thing stopping us, these Jews who won't convert. We, the majority, are bringing about the brotherhood of man, the great communist revolution, the only thing stopping us, these capitalist Jews. We, the Germans, are bringing about the great racially pure Aryan fatherland, the only thing stopping us, these race-polluting Jews. And today in America, you see it on the right and the left. On the right, it's, we white Christian Americans are bringing back white Christian civilization to America. And the only thing stopping us are these Jews who are importing Black and brown immigrants to replace white people. That is the extremely racist and anti-Semitic conspiracy theory known as the Great Replacement theory. It is an ugly, disgusting lie. On the left, you have, we, this very moral group of people, we are bringing about the revolution of anti-colonialism, anti-Zionism. And the only thing stopping us are these colonialist Zionists, which is a polite way of saying Jews. And so, I think it's very important to understand, as Yossi Klein Halevi, the journalist, puts it, what you see again and again is whatever is the worst thing in a society, that is what the Jews are deemed to be. Whatever is the worst thing among a particular population, that is what the Jews are deemed to be. And I think we're kind of seeing that on both the right and the left today.
If anti-Semitism defines so much or has defined so much of Jewish identity, how do we reclaim that? How have you reclaimed that? And how have you found joy in your Jewish identity, especially after doing this book and immersing yourself in all of this extremely depressing perspective?
I hear this kind of line among many Jews, and it breaks my heart. It's this sort of self-flagellation of like, if we just had the right PR campaign, if we just had the right tweet, then we would fight anti-Semitism. It's our fault. We're doing such a bad job fighting anti-Semitism. And, I love the ambition there. I think that is so sweet. But there are 16 million of us in the whole world. That's with an M, million. It's like the size of like the 5th largest city in China. You're a Chinese city. There are billions of people who don't really love us out there. And the idea that we, this tiny group of people, we're going to somehow change the minds of billions of people. I really respect the ambition, but I think that's a tough one. I think it's sort of like trying to bail out a tsunami with buckets. If enough of us do it, I'm sure we can make a difference. And I have such respect for the people who are doing that work. I think it's very important. But I also would just suggest that maybe we should put a little more of our energy into building an arc to weather the storm. And, to me, that arc is engaging deeply with our traditions. It's reclaiming, I think, some of what we lost when we were assimilating and trying to fit in. We have thousands of years of texts that have such wisdom about the human condition, about how to be a good person and lead a worthy life and find profound spiritual connection. We have just so many beautiful traditions. And so, I think that what we can really do is we can be Jews. And to be a Jew has always been to be different. That was kind of our value proposition thousands of years ago when we came along and said, hey guys, monotheism, totally different way of thinking. We said, hey, every human being is created in the image of God, which is an idea that every human being is infinitely worthy, which again, this is the idea that underlies things like liberalism, democracy, human rights. These are really earth-shatteringly different countercultural ideas. And we have so many more of those that I still think the world needs today. So I think that rather than just being anti-Semites, I think that we can be proud Jews instead. And we can really focus on becoming more learned, more vibrant members of our communities, engaging in more of our traditions and our rituals. I also think, Dara Horan has been doing a lot of great work about educating kids about Jewish civilization. Rather than having, young people only know about the Jews via the Holocaust, she really wants to teach young people about Jewish civilization, ideas, and people. I think that is a very, very powerful and very helpful idea.
So how are you doing this? How do you spend each week? How do you reclaim some of these traditions and joy?
For me, it's studying. That's really how I engage. I have various Hurwitzes where I study Jewish texts. I love reading Jewish books. And I love participating in the Jewish community. I love engaging with various Jewish organizations, serving on various committees and just trying to be part of this project of reclaiming Judaism, of making it more accessible to more Jews. This is what I love doing. And I'll be starting in January. I'm actually going to be starting a rabbinic program at the Hartman Institute. That's a part-time program, and I'm not planning to be a congregational rabbi, but I do want to keep writing books. And I'm really grateful for this opportunity to get a much deeper, more thorough Jewish education than the one I've kind of given to myself and, kind of cobbled together. I think this is going to be a really extraordinary opportunity. So I'm very excited about that.
Oh, wow. Well, congratulations. I look forward to welcoming you back to the podcast and calling you Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us, Sarah.
Such a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
If you missed last week's episode, be sure to tune in for my conversation with Dr. Eugene Kandel, chairman of the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange. We talked about Israel's financial resilience after the war against Hamas, missed economic opportunities with Jordan and Egypt, and the success of the Abraham Accords. And speaking of, don't miss our special series, Architects of Peace, the story of the Abraham Accords. As the hostages return and that region looks to its future, we're following those developments, and a final episode is coming soon. Thank you for listening. This episode is brought to you by AJC. Our producer is Atara Lakritz. Our sound engineer is TK Broderick. You can subscribe to People of the Pod on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Google Podcasts, or learn more at ajc.org/peopleofthepod. The views and opinions of our guests don't necessarily reflect the positions of AJC. We'd love to hear your views and opinions or your questions. You can reach us at peopleofthepod@ajc.org. If you've enjoyed this episode, please be sure to tell your friends, tag us on social media with #PeopleOfThePod, and hop on to Apple Podcasts to rate us and write a review to help more listeners find us. Tune in next week for another episode of People of the Pod.